Hi, I'm Dr. Sam Hazledine, and today I'm back again with Dr. Danielle Jones, who is known online as Mama Dr. Jones. Now, Dr. Jones is a multi-channel social influencer. She literally has millions of followers, a couple of million and plus. She's an ONG specialist and from the US, but currently living and working in Invercargill in the south of New Zealand. Danielle really uses her platform to address medical, challenging areas, I think, of medicine, and she does it in what I find is a very engaging way. And she also uses her platforms for advocacy, and never more so, I'd say, than recently with the decision in the US to overturn Roe v. Wade. So that's why I thought it would be great to get back together. And have a conversation. So it's great to see you again, Danielle. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here again.
It's awesome. Look, we'll jump straight to it. Roe versus Wade being overturned. In your opinion, why is that such an issue?
It's obviously concerning for a lot of reasons, but the primary reason is that it's going to lead to worse outcomes. We know this from the data. We know that this is unsafe. We know that banning abortion does not make anyone safer. It only increases the riskiness of procedures that people seek and delays care to a point where abortions are happening later and later because of inability to access care earlier in the pregnancy.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's many doctors who would disagree with that. But I think the thing I wanted to have a conversation today is about advocacy and in relation to this, but also wider when it comes to doctors, because you've taken a real position of advocacy in this situation. And why did you feel? I mean, obviously, why did you feel that it was important for you to do that?
I think it's hard. I grew up in a very conservative area of Texas, and so I grew up kind of indoctrinated with this idea that I didn't get to come to a conclusion about things like this on my own. I was kind of given my ideas and opinions about it as I was growing up. And so it became more and more important to me as I got to a place online where I had a voice and where I was in a space where it was safe, because when I was in the middle of Texas, it didn't always feel safe to talk about these things. But it got to a point where I felt like I need to discuss this with people in a way that would have potentially reached me when I was at that point where I was not able to make my own opinions or decide how I felt. So it took a long time to really unlearn and then to reestablish my own feelings on this topic. And I think that's important for anyone, but I've been given a platform and I hope to use it for the right purposes.
Yeah, and so when it comes to the advocacy, I guess what would you say? Is education the main purpose? What's your purpose for actually really using your voice?
Always education is number one. I work in a field where a lot of things that we do are very taboo. People aren't often taught about sex ed, about their own body, about abortion, about seeking, abortion in times of dire stress. And I want to be an educator on the internet. And I also want to be someone that can reliably convey scientific and evidence-based information in a way that people actually want to consume it. I think that's important to really get across your point, is you have to be able to explain things in a way that doesn't bore people in the process.
Yeah, sure. And so education is number one. Do you feel that through this, through advocacy, through people using their voice, do you think change is an option in this situation?
I certainly hope so. My husband used to tell me, you're not going to change anyone's mind on these topics. Don't argue with people on the internet. And over the years, I have now gotten to a place where I think that sometimes I actually do make a difference and make change. And he even says now, he kind of is the first screener on my emails so that I don't get overwhelmed with the ones that aren't so nice. And he says, you get so many emails that say, I'd never thought about it this way. You've changed my mind on this topic. Or even just, I always knew I didn't agree with the information that was given to me growing up, but I couldn't voice why. And so I hope that by speaking about it, I don't know that I can make change on a large scale from a political standpoint, but I hope that I can make just kind of a wave of people being able to talk about this more and develop their own ideas and opinions about things a little bit more.
Give them a different perspective, help them shift for themselves personally.
Sure, or even maintain their perspective, but learn how to adequately voice it to people who maybe don't agree with them.
give them a better way of articulating it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. And so in this situation, there's been a lot of people who, I mean, there's huge outcry on both sides of the political spectrum. Do you feel, I guess, how am I trying to say this? Do you feel that, I guess there's an intersection here of medicine and politics. And, where do you think the place is for medicine to drive, policy rather than, political ideology? I guess that's because that's what it seems like from the outside. You look from New Zealand and it feels very ideological as opposed to medical. I mean, that's why we're not spending a lot of time going through why is it better for women to be able to get abortions, because I think from a medical perspective, we all know that. Where do you feel like doctors, missed an opportunity, or do you feel that they were just ignored when it came to actually setting this policy?
It's hard. I feel like I get a lot of comments that say, oh, I really like your content, but you're too political now, or you talk too much about this or that. And my answer to that when people say that online is always, I will stop talking about politics when politics is not in my exam room with my patient. And I want to push that off on people as I didn't choose for politics to come in and start finagling with how I can take care of my patients. They forced us into that, and I won't be silent because somebody else has made it my problem. So I will always continue to talk about anything, including politics, as long as it affects my patients and as long as it's something that I want to talk about. These are my platforms. They're for education, but I also deserve a place, because I've built them, to express how I feel. And in that same vein, I think, I don't know that doctors were ignored. I struggle because I often will see people like me, doctors who have platforms and have a voice, say, it's your duty, you need to be speaking about this, to other people who are silent. And I struggle because sometimes I also feel that way. But at the same time, I can put myself back in a position where I had a private practice in Texas, and my literal safety and my patient population was threatened by me being open about how I felt or advocating for topics like this that are very, very not acceptable in that environment. So, we have to deal with the issue of, are you safe speaking about it? And yes, doctors have been ignored, but we've also probably not done enough. But, who is it really our job to be out of the clinic and on the steps of Congress trying to yell at people because they're taking away what we're able to do? I don't know. It's very complex.
Yeah, that's probably an understatement, isn't it? It is complex, and I mean, with regards to this, as a doctor, I guess taking obviously a very firm position on this, has it come at a cost to your relationship with some of your patients?
I don't think I've never had a patient say that, but I'm certain that there are patients that I've had in the past who don't necessarily agree with me. That being said, I offer care to my patients in a very non-judgmental and non-biased way. So I truly believe that a majority of patients that have ever been with me in real life know me well enough that they respect my opinions and how I state them, even if they disagree with me, because they know that my goal is always to give good care to my patients. Has it come at the cost of, if I were not working in a place where people just got assigned to me and had to see whoever they could, would I not have certain patients because of that? Sure. I don't doubt that there would be people who would rather see somebody who doesn't believe that an accessing termination is important for people in the United States. That being said, I don't really care. Like, I can't sacrifice my ability to speak out for the people that I have in my patient population that I know these things harm, because it makes somebody else uncomfortable. They're free to see somebody else. I don't have to be for everyone.
From a doctor perspective, I mean, I think a thing I sort of think about, because obviously with Roe v. Wade, I like a lot of people, thought about this a lot more, because it hadn't been, I guess, in the things I was thinking about, prior to that. And the way I sort of thought about it is, you're going to have a spectrum of belief and approach, and pro-life as it is not actually, it's a single dot on the spectrum. It's one end of it, and then pro-choice includes that dot. If you've got Venn diagrams, it includes pro-life, but it includes everything else as well. And the more I thought about it, the more I sort of thought there's no responsible place for a doctor to be pro-life, and because you can be, like me, I sort of, if I was in a situation, I would try and avoid abortion at all. I'm not a woman, but you know what I mean. Obviously we try and avoid it, but that's probably the case with most people. Pro-life is very binary, isn't it?
Yeah, I try to avoid putting myself into either box. And I think that part of the problem that the United States have right now is these stringent boxes, because I will often hear people say, I'm pro-life, I vote pro-life, but if you want to have an abortion, that's not my business. Well, that is the very essence of pro-choice, and
Sure.
but that's why I try to avoid these labels. So I'm sure I've called myself pro-choice at some point in the past, but what I think is really important is that we not need so badly to fit into one of these two categories that we can't even consider what it means. And I know how people get to that point, because I grew up in a space where you were not allowed to say, I'm pro-choice. It had to be, I'm pro-life, but if you want an abortion, that's none of my business. But that affects how you vote, and how you vote affects what that other person's choice can be. So I don't like the labels. I'm not, here to tell anybody what the ethical choice would be or what I would do, because at the very end of the day, like, it doesn't matter what I would do. I have a lot of money. I have a lot of social support. I have a partner. If I was 16 and I was pregnant, my mother would not have kicked me out of the house. I wouldn't have been homeless and unable to feed myself. I don't have two other kids, and I'm on, government support and can't afford to feed my other kids if I have to buy formula. These are the things that, like, of course I wouldn't choose abortion. I'm not in a position where I would need to, statistically. But there's a lot of people who don't have that privilege, and it's not my right to tell them that they can't do something because of that.
No. I think what you say, I mean, in this situation as well, I think the labels thing is a great insight, because, and I'm sure a think tank thought it up, much like, changing global warming to climate change. Let's call one pro-life, because it feels hard to not be pro-life, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and
Like,
it was,
you're
don't
not
you
pro-life,
hit
what
the
are
nail
you?
on
You're pro-death? I mean, what are you?
Right. And you hit the nail on the head there. It was an intentional politicization of this topic during the Reagan administration. It was intentionally made to be something that was clung onto by religious people. And before that, most churches were not either stringently opposed or in support of termination in general. It was just thought to be an individual's decision that had no place in day-to-day conversation. And it intentionally was made into a political pawn to win votes after the Reagan administration. Yeah.
I mean, as a doctor who's very, who's vocal about this and who is in the public eye, you've mentioned, that you get some great feedback, and your husband has been, probably happily surprised that, minds have been shifted. Does it come at a personal cost too?
Of course, it's exhausting, and people are not always very nice about it. So I spend a lot of time having to ignore comments that call me a murderer and all these things that, like, I've never even worked in a hospital system where I would be able to offer elective termination if I could. This is not about me wanting to protect what I do on a day-to-day basis. It's my wanting to protect the autonomy of people to make their own decisions. And, it's a mental cost, but it's nothing in comparison to my patients who have to, I had a patient when I was working in Texas who had a lethal fetal anomaly that wasn't diagnosed until 20 plus weeks. And it was cheaper for her to fly to Colorado, have her termination done there, stay in a hotel, and fly back than it would have been to get care in Texas. So these are that pales in comparison to me having to listen to a bunch of nameless, faceless idiots call me names on the internet.
Yeah. It's pretty heartbreaking when you hear those sort of stories, isn't it? About what a political decision that has such huge, real human personal cost, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's and I don't think people who, these things will never affect the people who put them into place. The politicians, they're wives, their mistresses, their daughters, they will always be able to access a termination if they need it, because they can just fly to another state. And that's why it's so simple to them. Just fly to another state, just go to another state. Well, my patients in Central Texas, it would have been a 10-hour drive to get to another state, and that state may also not be offering abortion, and not to mention they may be completely overloaded in their ability to care for people. So you can't expect people to be able to take a week off work when they're already at a socioeconomic disadvantage. They're living in a place where they can't tell anyone why they're taking off work because they will be labeled as a murderer and just ostracized from their community. This is impractical. Of course, this is not a option for most people.
Do you see other areas of medicine that are at this level of risk, that it could go this way? I mean, this is a very political one, and we'll talk a little bit in about the US and the rest of the world. But do you see other areas where, obviously with masks and vaccinations and mandates, that was a pretty politicized piece too. Do you see other areas that have this level of risk, coming down the pipeline towards the ability of doctors to care for their patients?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a pretty unique situation, which also should speak to why this is something we should be talking about, in that this doesn't really happen outside of things that just affect people who have a uterus. The other side of that is the LGBTQ community and the ability of transgender people to access care, and the ability of gender dysphoric children to access puberty blockers, which is a very evidence-based and safe intervention that has a lot of science behind it. And now you have political leanings coming in and trying to dictate how people, get their medical care. It's absolutely insane. Like, I can't even hardly talk about it without getting frustrated, because the amount of science we have on these topics and the importance of the ability to access care for both of these things is so evident in the literature that it just boggles my mind that, and it's also at some point a little bit offensive to not be able to, like, people think, oh, well, we need to regulate abortion because you're going to abort a baby on its birthday. Like, do you really think we spend our whole career in our whole 20s learning how to do this job because we just want to kill babies? That's asinine, right? So it's frustrating too, because people in my family might post things like this on the internet about, they just want to kill. And I'm like, who is they? I think it's me. Is it me? Do you really think that I want to do that? Like, this is so insane.
Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. And I asked the question quite generally. I didn't have an answer, but you're right. The areas that are at risk are women and, essentially non-straight white male.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I can't think of any procedure or medication or anything like that a non-minoritized group wants to access or needs to access that has political hand-holding on it.
It seems a bit crazy that women are a minoritized group.
Yeah, I mean,
but I hear what you. I mean, but I hear what
we
you're
are
saying.
now, at least in the U.S.
It just makes. I agree. It makes absolutely no sense. So in terms of these are the areas that are at risk. Women, as you say, non-male, essentially. I mean, it seems crazy that as we grow up as a white male. For me, having two daughters was such a I guess an eye opener, and it made me think about things that I hadn't thought about before. And I think that's a good thing. But what do you see? What do you see as the way doctors can advocate for their patients, for women, for these minority groups? Like, how can doctors step up? Not everyone has a 2 million person social platform. Very few people do. But how do you think doctors need to step up in these places, in these situations?
I think from a standpoint of having been there, that things that I could have done better when I was working in a place like Texas where my patients couldn't get access to care was making sure that everybody who walked through my door knew that they were in a no judgment zone and that they could talk to me about whatever they wanted. I had the experience of working in Texas and then moving to Hawaii to work there for a little while, and Hawaii is much more liberal than Texas, and seeing how freely people came in and expected me to be a safe place. They would openly talk about a termination or a complication that they had, where in Texas, I can count on one hand the number of people who admitted to me that they had had a termination in the past and didn't do it with a air of like, I'm afraid you're going to get angry at me or won't give me good care if I tell you this.
Right.
So I think if you don't have the place to advocate politically or to advocate publicly, that making sure your patients know they're safe with you is the primary thing that you can do.
Yeah, that's it's something you can do on a daily basis, isn't it?
And educating yourself on options and how to direct your patients to those, your front desk staff, because people are going to be getting phone calls about, can I come there for help? And obviously the answer is no now, but needing to be able to give them, well, here are your resources. Here's what you can do.
Something that just popped into my head. What do you think? And I don't know if this is but do you think that the doctors who are non-minority? So I'm just going to say, white male doctors, do they have a more important role? Not saying. Do they have a really important role to play in stepping up in these situations? Because, I know I find it's a hard topic sometimes to discuss because you don't know what you can say, what you can't say. So I'll just say it. I mean, I was working, years ago. We set up a company to help sports people beyond sport. Lives beyond sport, because the statistics were terrible. They were bankrupt, they didn't have careers, life was really tough. And I remember we were working on this for sort of, I was in about 2 or 3 years. And I suddenly turned to my business partner and I was like, I've just suddenly understood what this whole white male privilege thing is. Because, a lot of these sports people come from Maori Polynesian backgrounds, and I just hadn't been exposed to it. And I just saw how much harder it actually was for them, in terms of building, their finances. They had bigger families to support, actually creating things and aspirations beyond the sport. And it suddenly hit me, and I was like, I just suddenly realized what it meant, that I haven't had any headwinds myself, from that perspective. I've never walked into a room, no matter what color or what gender, and gone, I don't feel like I should be here. And I guess that's what white male privilege is. But what do you see, people who haven't actually experienced headwinds, and we've all experienced headwinds, and I know people make the argument that, I haven't had anything handed to me, but where do you see, the role of non-minority doctors to actually take a more vocal, a more active role in advocating for minority groups?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I want to be clear that as a also white person, I don't feel like I really fall into that group either, because I am white and privileged, and make no mistake, if I was in Texas and needed an abortion, I would be able to access that.
Sure.
So I would count myself into the group of, it's important for me to use my voice and advocate. And I think, when you say headwinds, that's a good way to explain this. Like, you can take two people who have equal ability and equal drive to do something, or even a person on this side with more drive to do something. And if you're running directly straight ahead and this person's running into a wind against them, it doesn't matter how hard they work, they're never going to catch up with you. It's harder to do it even with the same drive and the same ability. And that's what systemic racism and systemic socioeconomic suppression does to people over generations. It's a trickle-down effect. Just like anybody who had a parent or grandparent that was a victim of Nazi Germany, they are going to have a trickle-down effect from that for their whole life and generations to come. So I think the most important thing that you can do is start learning to recognize that. And obviously I shouldn't be the voice of this because I do not fall into those categories, but I think it's very important for us to speak out and for us to talk about these things, because putting that onus on a person who's already running into the wind is not fair to them. They are oftentimes, not always, I don't want to, they're not a monolith, but oftentimes already exhausted with having to advocate for themselves as a person, that you need to have people on the other side, the people who look like the people making the rules, to advocate to those people why it's important to make sure that, and I think New Zealand does a little bit better job than the US of making sure, with Tariti Waitangi to make sure that the Maori people are involved in the equity and dispersion of healthcare, but obviously we can do better here too.
It's a difficult situation. I did a post the other day and I specifically used the word, what does it mean to be a feminist father? And I used the word feminist because when I Google what feminists mean, it just means you believe in equal rights. And it was amazing the amount of guys who said, look, well, that's just being a good father, but, I don't agree with the word feminist. I was like, well, just Google it. It's just interesting, I think, to challenge people's perspectives on what it actually means. And when you boil it down, most people, they do believe in equality, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, most people will tell you they do, but I don't know if most people's actions actually convey that that's how they truly feel.
Yeah, fair enough. Look, I mean, often the world, the US leads the world in many situations. Do you feel, I mean, is this right now a US problem? Is this a problem that could become a global problem?
Yeah, I mentioned this on Instagram when we were talking about it one day, but there were a lot of people saying, I'm so glad to live in New Zealand, or you're so lucky to live in New Zealand. And yeah, me too. But the way that the U.S. does things has a trickle-down effect on the rest of the world. And when we lose our shit, sorry, I don't know if I'm on your pie. When we lose our mind,
and US it definitely lost its shit. Oh, it's okay to say that.
when we go doing crazy things, it empowers the extremists in the rest of the world to do the same thing. So yes, I mean, obviously this is a U.S. problem, but I would strongly encourage the people of Australia and New Zealand to not get complacent, because it would only take one power change in your government to land you right back where you were before. And abortion has been legal here less time than it was in the States, so easier.
It's only been legal. I didn't realize that until looking into it. It's only for a couple of years.
Yeah.
The recent thing, and a lot of politicians didn't vote for it. That to me was a scary thing.
65% of the, I don't know the two party names, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you've got National and Labour.
Yeah, so 64% of the more conservative group of politicians here voted against legalization of abortion rights.
Yeah, so
it's not safe. Don't get complacent. You have to get out there and use your voice.
That answers the question, doesn't it? It's not just a US problem. It's like just around the corner for a lot of places, including New Zealand. I think it's, which makes it, which is why it's so worth talking about. As a doctor, who cares. I mean, you care so much about this. And I have huge respect for that. And we have a big challenge, obviously, in the US and potentially elsewhere. Where do we go from here? Where do you as a doctor, or where do we as doctors go from this place?
I wish I had an easy answer to that. And so many people have asked me that since all of this happened. And I think other than just continuing to speak out, that unfortunately probably what it is going to take is somebody who is wide enough and rich enough having a bad outcome or losing their life for people to realize that this was such a bad idea. And unfortunately, before we get to that point, I think it will take a lot of people who don't look like that suffering even worse outcomes before we end up having change. So I am a relatively positive person, and even up until about 2 years ago, I was saying there's no way that they'll overturn Roe v. Wade, maybe even more recently than that. But I don't know now. I don't know. It feels a little bit hopeless. It feels like something really terrible is going to happen before we make actual revisions.
It's horrible hearing that, but I'm an optimist too. So how do we as optimists maintain that optimism? Because giving up obviously isn't an option for you, for me, for anyone who cares. How do we maintain optimism, do you think? How do you keep a positive outlook when the reality is that it's gonna have to get worse before it gets better?
Yeah, I don't know. It feels for me, for the first time, very hard to be optimistic, just with climate change being ignored and these kind of things happening that take away people's autonomy. But for me, the day-to-day work on the ground, taking care of patients and being in the clinic is what makes me feel like this is still, worth it to be in this field despite so much contention, and being able to use my voice online to give people resources or answer their questions when they're at a place where they don't know where to go next. And, discussing with other doctors and making sure that at very least we can publicize resources that will help people potentially. But obviously that requires them to have access to the internet and an understanding of how to find that information. So it's just, little day-to-day things and hoping that eventually something swings the pendulum to the other side.
Yeah. I mean, as you're talking there, I was thinking, about what you said before about, doctors creating a safe environment for their patient. It's got me thinking about, how do you maintain optimism is, I guess you focus on your own circle of influence and you focus on what you can control, what you can have a positive influence on. And that's, your patients, your family, your department, maybe your hospital. I guess, and I feel for you because the challenge you have, with having 2 million followers is your circle of influence is bigger. So it probably feels like you've got a bigger weight on your shoulders than your ONG colleague that you're working with.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure, but I certainly every morning wake up feeling like I've got to say something life-changing and important and encourage people to stay in the fight. And it does get a little bit exhausting and distracting from real life sometimes.
I bet it does. Well, yeah, I mean, and that's a whole other discussion. But
I hate to end on a depressing note. Why don't we talk about something a little bit more happier?
What should we finish on? Okay, what are you optimistic about? Okay, there's one. What are you optimistic about?
Well, I love working in Aotearoa. The ONG team here where I'm at is incredible. We are very short-staffed, but we have such amazing midwives and specialists here, and I have very much enjoyed my time so far. I've been working here for the past 8 months, and it's awesome. And I have so many wonderful colleagues and friends, and my kids have made a little Kiwi village around here, and we're just so thankful for how openly we've been welcomed into this country.
That's fantastic. Are they starting to develop New Zealand accents?
They don't really develop an accent, but they use the inflection that you use, which I've found out recently is called a high-rising terminal, where you raise the octave at the end of a sentence.
Oh, really?
Yeah, exactly. And so they started doing that. And then just little, like language changes, rubbish and gumboots and things we don't say in the States. So my parents like to get them to use their Kiwi words when they call them.
Excellent. That gives them something to laugh about. Have you found, practicing in a less litigious environment varied? How have you found that to be different?
I don't know. I think it's not a whole lot different because I think, at least for me, worrying back home, I would worry about bad outcomes more than getting sued, which obviously getting sued is kind of a part of life as an obstetrician in the US. But I would, my primary goal, even back home, was not to avoid litigation. It was to do the right thing for the patient. So I haven't really noticed a big difference in that other than I don't have to pay as much for malpractice. But it is nice being here where, back home we did a lot of things the GPs do here. So lots of women like pap smears and annual exams and breast exams and just basic birth control visits and stuff. So I really enjoy being kind of more of a specialist here where I just get to see the higher acuity things.
Yeah, it's cool. Do what you and only you can do. I mean, that's always, I think, for me, it's, when you feel good about your work, it's when you're doing stuff that, you couldn't pawn off to someone else.
Exactly. Things that I didn't learn my intern year or my first year or my last year of medical school. So it's been nice to practice at the high end of my scope. Excellent.
And I know you've got a cat as well, so that's got to be a positive.
Yes. My daughter has a cat, and
you're very clear about that. It's not your cat.
Yeah, because I have to make sure if she ever listens to this, she knows I'm acknowledging that it's her cat.
Okay, it's her cat, and you're not a cat person. I get all that, but you seem to.
I am a cat person with this cat. It's a
you are
cat.
Okay. You've opened up your heart a little bit. Well, it's like your husband said. You can change minds, can't you?
Yeah, exactly.
You get the right cat.
Yes.
Well, look, Danielle, it's been really great to connect and see you again. I do feel for you. I know you've got this big platform, so and as you said, you feel like every day you've got to say something inspiring. But the thing is, you are, and I think that I sort of see this, the content you put out, and I think you manage to take difficult things and actually make them sometimes quite funny and sometimes quite entertaining. And like you're obviously shifting people's perspectives and giving people a voice. And I think the one thing I took out of this as well was that no matter what level of advocacy you are as a doctor, and I think anyone listening has got to pick where they want to show up. And I guess based on their background, based on who they are, based on how much headwind they've had or not, we've all got a choice to make as to how much we actually step up, into the public eye, whether you're advocating at a policy level, whether you're advocating on a more public social platform, to help give people a voice or actually have a voice for people, to educate people, or whether it's just with every individual that you see, creating a safe environment. I think we all have a place to play, and I think, to me, what I think will be useful out of this for doctors listening is to make a conscious decision about where they do want to play from that perspective. I think that's important.
Absolutely. And just having the conversation, I think oftentimes just talking about things and voicing how you feel will help you really establish where you are. And these are tough topics, even for those of us in medicine. So just having the conversation, being willing to talk about it, can really help solidify where you are and what you feel like you need to do going forward to be a good advocate for your patients.
Yeah, absolutely. The more we talk, the more we have these conversations. As I said, having two daughters was just prompted me to think about things differently and have conversations. Absolutely. And as we do that, as we think, and our perspectives can shift and expand and grow. So, look, thank you so much. It's been really great. I know you've just come off 48 hours call. Anyone listening, she's doing 1 and 2 at the moment, and life is pretty tough working as a doctor at the moment with COVID and all that jazz. So, look, thank you for making the time and for creating the space to have this conversation.
Thanks for having me again. It's always a joy.
Absolutely.